Masechet Nedarim Daf Ayin He. We begin with the Mishnah. Haomer leishto kol hanedarim shetidori mikan al she'avo mimakom peloni harei hen chayamin. We saw this a few dapim ago. A man tells his wife, any vows that you will make from now until I come back from this place, I'm going on a trip for a few days, any vows that you make while I am away, I want them to be ratified. Lo amar kilum, that is a meaningless statement. On the other hand, haren mufarin, if he says that they should be nullified, Rabbi Eliezer omer mufar, Chachamim omerim eno mufar. That is a machloket. Rabbi Eliezer says they are nullified. Chachamim say they are not nullified. All right, so it's easy to understand Chachamim. They are consistent, and they say that in both cases one cannot ratify or nullify future vows in one blanket statement. And that makes sense. If there is no vow, the vow does not exist yet, she didn't take it yet, well then how could you ratify something that does not exist? How could you nullify something that does not exist? So that would be Chachamim. However, for it to be Eliezer, why would he make a difference between ratifying and nullifying? There's many explanations. One is that it wouldn't make sense to ratify anything that she may say. Who knows? What if she says something that will be damaging, that will be harmful? Right? Does he really want to ratify across the board anything that she says? Whereas nullifying, that makes more sense. This is, I don't want any vows. Right? There's no downside to having zero vows. It's actually good not to have any vows. And so it makes more sense that a person would really mean a blanket nullification, but a blanket ratification, it's hard. That's harder. Second explanation is that while you cannot ratify something that doesn't exist, because it just doesn't exist. So how can you give a positive stamp of approval on something that doesn't exist? Whereas to cancel, you can pre-cancel. It doesn't exist, and now it will certainly not even come into existence. That's kind of the understanding that we're going to see from the following explanation in the Mishnah, as well as it's going to come up in the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, im hefer nedarim sheba'u lichlal isur, lo yafer nedarim shelo ba'u lichlal isur. So Rabbi Eliezer defends his position that you can nullify vows that will come in the future based on a kal vachomer. If you can nullify, if the husband can nullify vows of the wife that already came into existence, she made a vow in the morning. That vow exists, right? Right now, it's in play. And so if he can void a vow that already exists on that day, then all the more so the husband should be able to nullify a vow that does not yet have a prohibition, right? If a prohibition already exists, then that would be harder to take away than a prohibition that doesn't yet exist. And so if the husband has the right to nullify her vow that's already there, all the more so he should be able to nullify a vow that has not yet had taken place, a prohibition that has not yet occurred. Okay, that's the kal vachomer. The rabbis counter. Amru lo harehu omer isha yekimenu ve'isha yeferenu et sheba lichlal hekem ba lichlal hefer lo ba lichlal hekem lo ba lichlal hefer. In that chapter in Bamidbar chapter 30, that has all the laws of vows and nullifying them. It says that her husband can ratify them and her husband can nullify them. By putting these two clauses back to back, it's comparing ratification to nullification. Anything that can be ratified can also be nullified, whereas anything that cannot be ratified cannot be nullified. So you have to say the same law for both. And so the Rabbanan are consistent. We say the same law for both. The husband cannot ratify or nullify anything in the future. And that's good. That's based on this hekesh, whereas this is a challenge to be Eliezer. You see from this pasuk that your kal vachomer should not work, because you have to do either all or nothing, either both of them. She can do both or nothing, and you agree already that the husband cannot ratify, so you should agree that the husband cannot nullify. All right, that's the two opinions in the Mishnah. And now we're going to ask a question according to Rabbi Eliezer. Ibaya lehu, Rabbi Eliezer, mechal chalin ubatlin, od yama la chalin kelal. The question is that when the husband, before he goes away on a trip, he says, vows that you make will be nullified. And then he goes away. And she makes a vow, I'm not going to drink wine. So according to the Eliezer, that works. But how does it work? Is it that the vow applies and then is immediately canceled? Or does it not take effect at all? It doesn't even apply, not even for 1 second. That's the question. So l'may nafka mina, what would be a practical difference? I mean, either way, there is no vow. So what's the difference if it kind of appears for a second, but then like a radioactive particle disappears, or if you just say that his statement prevents any vows from even coming to existence at all? What would be a practical difference? Kegon dat pisa charina behaden nidra. For example, if there's someone else there who hears this wife's vow, let's just say he has a friend over, and the wife makes a vow, I'm not going to drink wine. And then the friend hears that and says, Va'ani, me too. That's a good vow. I want to also do that. In general, when someone makes a vow, another person hearing it doesn't have to say the whole phrase of the vow. He could just say, me too, and then the vow will apply to that person as well. So in that case, Iyamart chalin havya tefisuta, Iyamart la chalin la ika meshasha. So if you say that her vow does apply, it does come into existence, and immediately the friend says va'ani, so then that friend will have a vow and will not be able to drink wine. And even though for the wife, because the husband made this clause before he left, so for the wife, after a second, it will be nullified. But for that 1 second, it did exist, and therefore the friend who said va'ani right away will have a vow upon her. Whereas, if you say it does not apply at all, this preventative measure that the husband says, right, no vows, means that she can't even create a vow at all. In that case, when the friend says, me too, she will not be obligated to the vow because she's copying something that doesn't exist. And so the copy does not exist either. All right, so that would be the practical ramification. And now we're going to have about 4 different attempted proofs. We'll see 3 of them today and then 1 on the next daf. So, what is the answer? So, proof number 1. Tashema. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, im hefer nedarim sheba'u lichlal isur, lo yafer nedarim shelo ba'u lichlal isur, shema mina lo chalin. Look at Rabbi Eliezer's language in our very Mishnah, in his Kavachomed. He said, if a husband can nullify vows that have already come into existence and became a prohibition, meaning vows that she already made, let's say in the morning, and he hears about it in the afternoon. So all the more so, can't a husband nullify a vow that has not yet become a prohibition? So you see, it says that it has not yet become a prohibition. That means that a vow that she makes in the future does not even become a prohibition at all. So you see, from this language, that it does not apply at all. Isn't this a good proof that the prohibition does not even come into existence? And the answer is no. Mi katane she'enan ba'in shelo ba'u katane adayin lo ba'u. No, that doesn't. The Mishnah doesn't say that they will not come into existence, that they do not come into existence at all, but rather says they have not yet come into existence, because at the time that the husband makes the statement, the vow was still going to be in the future. It's going to be next week. While he's away. So at the time, Eliezer's point is simply that if he can nullify a vow that already happened and created a prohibition, all the more so he can nullify a vow beforehand to a prohibition that has not come. But at the time that she then makes the vow, it could very well be that the vow does come into existence, a prohibition does come into existence, and then it's nullified. But that should be easier to nullify since it was already preempted. with this nullification beforehand. But the language of the Mishnah does not mean that it does not come to existence at all, it just has not yet come into existence. Okay, so there's no proof from there. A second proof, that's Braita. We find this statement in a Tosefta as well. Tashema amar lehen Rabbi Eliezer. So this is Tosefta is adding another argument that Rabbi Eliezer makes to defend himself. He says, "Uma b'makom she'en mefer nidre atzmo mishenadar mefer nidre atzmo ad shelo yidor." מקום שמפר נדרי אשתו מי שתידור, אין עוד דין שיפר נדרי אשתו עד שלא תידור. He's making a different קו החומר here. Generally, a man himself, if he makes a vow, he cannot undo his own vow, even on the same day, even 1 minute later. If I make a vow, then I say, I'm not going to eat donuts, and then a minute later, I say, oh, you know what? I really want to eat donuts. I can't undo my own vow. I can go to a chacham, I can go to a beit din, undo the vow, but a man cannot undo his own vow. So that's the basis of the chomer. If in a situation where a person cannot undo his own vows that he already made, that's talking about a man, but yet he can undo vows beforehand that he has not yet made. In other words, a man can say, listen, any vow, I know tomorrow I might be in the mood to make a vow, but I want to say from now that any vows I make tomorrow will be nullified. That's in fact what we do on Yom Kippur or before Rosh Hashanah. As part of the Hatarat Nedarim, we also say a statement for the future that any vows that we make in the coming year will not apply. So look at that. A man cannot nullify vows from in the past, but he can nullify vows in the future. So with that as a basis, makom, in a place where a man can nullify his wife's vow that she made already in the past. So that's certainly true. That's the basic law of a husband nullifying his wife's vow. All the more so, he should be able to nullify his wife's vow in the future. Okay, that's the Tosefta. Now let's analyze. My lav de ishto dum yadile, mahu de la chaylin af ishto name de la chaylin. So look how this Rabbi Eliezer in this baraita is comparing a man's vows to a wife's vows, and just like a man's vows do not even take effect at all when he says a statement from in the past, right? If they took effect, even for a second, then the man would have no right to nullify, because a man cannot nullify his own vows. So the only way to explain how a man can nullify his future vows is to say that when he makes the statement on Yom Kippur, that means that any vows that he will make do not even come into existence. And that's how it works. So just like a man's vows do not come into existence, so too a wife's vows do not come into existence if the husband made a declaration beforehand. So isn't this a good proof that they don't come into existence? Sounds like a good proof. And we answer, no, la hakediita. No, maybe these are separate categories, and maybe men's vows work differently from women's vows. A man's vow, yes, he can do this before, and it doesn't come into existence. But even though we're comparing them for the purposes of the Kal Vachomer, that doesn't mean that they're exactly the same in all ways. And so it could very well be that a woman's vows work differently, and they do come into existence. But according to the Rabbi Eliezer, we should still compare them and say, just like a man cannot nullify them from before, all the more so, a man can nullify his wife's vows from before, even though for his wife, they do come into existence for a second and then go away, and the logic would still work, and so we don't have to compare them precisely. All right, so that takes care of the second proof, and now we're going to try for a third proof. This next baraita does not have an exact parallel in the Tosefta, but looking at the Tosefta can still help us, because the Tosefta does have something that we don't have here, which is something that Rabbi Eliezer says, comparing our cases of vows to a mikveh. So Rabbi Eliezer already presented some comparison to a mikveh, and this baraita here is probably connected to the Tosefta, and what is the response that the Rabbanan told to be Eliezer. Okay, but we can analyze this response in itself. We're going to see in when we turn the page that there is another baraita or continuation of this baraita in which the rabbis give yet another refutation of Rabbi Eliezer. And so that's what we're going to be seeing now, these two baraitot that both counter Rabbi Eliezer. And so here the rabbis are countering with their own kal vachomer. Now this kal vachomer is a false one. It's going to lead to a false conclusion. And their point is that Rabbi Eliezer, you cannot make your kal vachomer, because if you apply a similar logic to a case of mikveh, you're going to get to a wrong conclusion, and therefore your premise, your kal vachomer also it does not work. Okay, so here's what they say. Uma mikveh shema'aleh et hatimein mitumatan. A mikveh, right? Regular ritual mikveh. Here's one that was found at Qumran, right? You see the stairs that go down. There's no basement there, so obviously it's a mikveh. A mikveh which takes something tameh and transforms it to be tahor, right? A person is tameh, he goes in, it's his past tum'ah, right? He was tameh, he became tameh yesterday, he goes into the mikveh, and now he becomes tahor, so it removes the tum'ah. And masil ala tehorim militameh, but a mikveh cannot work for future tum'ah. If you are tahor now, you can't go in the mikveh and say, I'm going to go in the mikveh in order to protect myself from becoming tameh tomorrow. That doesn't work, right? You can't preempt becoming tameh. So that's the analogy. Mikveh only works for the past, but not for the future. Adam she'en ma'aleh et hatemein mitumatan eno dinhu shelo yasir ala tehorin militameh. Now this is a curious analogy. We're comparing to the mikveh to a person's own body. If a person would swallow some item, has to be a vessel. What's a vessel that a person can swallow? I don't know. I'm thinking it has to be really small. Maybe a thimble, right? A thimble is a vessel. It's a useful item, and it could therefore can receive tum'ah. Now, a person, if there's a thimble that's a tameh thimble, and a person swallows it, it does not thereby become tahor. A human body does not act like as a mikveh. Even if that person, in fact, would go into a mikveh with the thimble inside their stomach, that thimble still would not become tahor, because a person's body is preventing the thimble from touching any water. And so even though the person becomes tahor, the thimble inside remains tameh. Okay, so a person's body does not purify something, yet it does not purify something. So therefore, all the more so should it not save something from becoming tameh. Now, actually, the law is the opposite. If someone would swallow a tahor thimble, right? They're tahor, they swallow a tahor thimble, it's in their stomach. And then that person touches a dead mouse and the person becomes tameh. Ironically, the thimble remains tahor. So a person's body actually acts as a barrier to the thimble inside. And so that is the law. But yet, based on the logic of the kal vachomer, we would think the opposite. That if a person's body cannot change past tum'ah into tahor, if they already swallowed it, all the more so it should not be able to prevent future tum'ah from making what's inside him tameh. But yet, that is in fact the law. A person's body cannot make something tahor from the past that was tameh, but yet it can protect something from becoming tahor in the future. So what you see from here is that the kal vachomer doesn't work. Shema mina lachaylin. Okay, from this baraita we can deduce that Rabbanan's interpretation of Rabbi Eliezer is that it could only work, Rabbi Eliezer's rule can only work by it not taking, the vow not taking effect in the first place. Just like regarding the tumah, the thimble inside the person's body. How does it work? It's not that the person's body, if the person swallowed it while it was tahor, and then the person becomes tameh. It's not that when he touches the dead mouse, that thimble becomes tameh for a second, but then becomes tahor by being in the person's body. That's not how it works. But rather, it works because the tum'ah does not transfer in the first place into the thimble, and it does not even apply at all. There is no tum'ah. That's how a person's body protects the thimble. And so therefore, by analogy, it would be the same thing with a vow. A husband can, nullify vows in the past. That vow already existed, his wife's vow, and now he can make it, nullify it. But for the future, the rabbis don't think this works at all. But the assumption to make it work for Rabbi Eliezer would be that the husband's statement beforehand prevents the vow from ever taking place, because if the vow existed, then how could you preempt and nullify it from beforehand? There's no way to do it. So it must be that it doesn't exist at all to begin with. Okay, so that would be the implication of the way that Rabbanan understand it be Eliezer, and we can understand that through the logic of their rejection, because in the logic of their rejection, the thimble cannot become tameh in the first place, and then the person's body make it tahor. It must be that the tum'ah does not come into existence, and so too the vow does not come into existence. Okay, so can we learn from here that according to this part of the Braita, the rabbis for Rabbi Eliezer are assuming that it does not come into existence, the vow at all, even for a second. Here's the problem. Emasefa, the continuation of that very Braita, includes yet another argument of the rabbis against Rabbi Eliezer, in which they say, Amru lo Rabbi Eliezer, im matbilin keli tameh litaher, yatbilu keli lechshei tameh litaher. Shema mina hailin. They have a simpler kavachomer, and they say, Rabbi Eliezer, you say that a vow that she took already in the past, the husband can nullify it, and that prohibition already exists. All the more so if she didn't take it yet, and the prohibition doesn't yet exist. That's what you said. Let's compare this to a mikveh. If you can dunk into the mikveh a vessel that is tameh and make it tahor, so you can take tum'ah that became tameh in the past and make it tahor. So all the more so, you should be able to take a vessel that's tahor and dip it now to prevent it from being tahor and becoming tameh in the first place, right? That would be the exact same logic, right, Rabbi Eliezer? This is actually a much closer parallel than the previous section of the Braita. Anyway, that's their point. And look at their language here, right? So yatbilu kili, put a tahor kili in the mikveh now beforehand, so that when it becomes tameh, it will become tahor. From this language here, you see that the rabbis are assuming that it does in fact become tameh, and then immediately comes tahor, right? I have a tahor bowl, and I'm going to dip it now, and I say, so that when it becomes tameh tomorrow, it will immediately become tahor. So that shema mina chaylin, that means that Rabbanan's assumption, in their understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, is that it does take effect for a second and then goes away. Of course, this is part of an argument against Rabbi Eliezer, but nevertheless, it reflects the rabbi's understanding of the mechanism that Rabbi Eliezer is using. And so, from this very, very same Baraita, we see the opposite conclusion. So what are we going to do with this Braita? You want to prove here that La Chaylin, from the continuation of the Braita, we prove that it does take effect. So, therefore, we cannot accept either conclusion. Here's what the rabbis are saying. Amri Rabbanan la kaimin lehon betamed Rabbi Eliezer. So we have to explain these two braitot, which are back to back, as follows. The rabbis, we have to say, the rabbis do not agree with they couldn't figure out, they could not determine the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore they rejected him and no matter what. This is what the rabbis are telling Rabbi Eliezer. What's your opinion? If you think that when the woman makes a vow, it does appear for a second, but then the husband's preemptive statement nullifies it, then well, then we will refute your opinion from this example of a bowl, right, where we were assuming that chaylin, and nevertheless this kal vachomer will reject your conclusion. And if you think that it does not come into existence at all, not even for a moment, well then that's why we presented the first kal vachomer, and that the mikveh itself, comparing a mikveh to a person's body, there we were assuming la chaylin, and we gave this ad absurdum argument as kal vachomer that doesn't work, to reject your argument that way. And that's why these two baraitot are back to back. That's why they assume, the first one assumes la chaylin, the second one assumes chaylin, because the rabbis are saying, no matter what you think, no matter which assumption you take, we have an argument to refute you. Therefore, we cannot determine from this set of two baraitot what the rabbis thought, or what Rabbi Eliezer thought, or what the rabbis thought Rabbi Eliezer thought, because they're just presenting both options, but there is no determination from this baraita at all. And on the next page, we'll see a last attempt to answer this question. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.